I wasn't supposed to touch him. And in a place like that, touching a man like Adrian Romano could cost you everything. But that night, everything already felt like it was slipping through my fingers, the kind of slow, quiet exhaustion that settles into your bones after too many double shifts and not enough sleep. The kind where even the golden lights of a five-star restaurant look dull around the edges, where every clink of crystal sounds distant, like it's happening in someone else's life, not yours. And I remember thinking as I adjusted my black apron for the third time in 5 minutes that if I could just make it to the end of my shift, just one more hour, I could go home, kick off my shoes, and forget this world existed. But then the doors opened, and everything changed, because when Adrian Romano walked in, the air didn't just shift, it tightened, like the room itself was holding its breath. Conversations softened without anyone being told. Forks paused mid-air, and even the piano in the corner seemed quieter, like it understood who had just arrived, and I didn't need anyone to whisper his name to know he wasn't just another wealthy customer. I saw it in the way the manager straightened his tie, in the way the host suddenly stood a little taller, in the way the men with him moved like they were part of the same shadow, precise and controlled, and I told myself not to look, not to get involved. Just take orders, refill glasses, stay invisible like I always did. But invisibility has a way of breaking when something feels off, and it was small at first, so small I almost ignored it. A flicker in the reflection of a wine glass, a hesitation in someone's hand that didn't match the calm on their face, the kind of detail most people miss because they're too busy looking at the obvious. But I wasn't most people. I'd spent years watching, learning how to read rooms just to survive in them. And something about that table wasn't right, something about the way one man avoided eye contact, the way another shifted his position just slightly, like he was waiting for a moment no one else could see. And I felt it then, that quiet warning in my chest, the one that tells you to walk away before things go wrong. And for a second, I almost listened. I almost turned toward the kitchen and let whatever was about to happen unfold without me. Because what did I have to gain by stepping in? What did I owe a man like him? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. But then Adrian lifted his glass, just slightly, and the angle, the position, the timing, it all lined up in a way that made my stomach drop. And suddenly leaving wasn't an option anymore. Not when I knew, not when I could see what no one else seemed to notice. So before I could talk myself out of it, before fear could catch up to my decision, I moved, my heart pounding so loud I was sure someone would hear it, crossing the distance between us in seconds that felt like minutes, every step louder than it should have been, every breath sharper. And when I reached him, I didn't explain, I didn't hesitate, I didn't think about consequences or rules or who he was. I just acted, closing the space between us and pressing my lips to his in a moment that wasn't about romance or impulse, but something far more dangerous, something calculated and desperate. Because if I was right, if my instincts were telling me the truth, then that single second, that unexpected interruption, might be the only thing standing between him and a mistake he wouldn't see coming. For half a second, he did not move, and in a room where every movement was calculated, that stillness felt louder than anything else. His breath paused against mine, controlled but sharp, like a man who was used to deciding everything before it happened, not reacting after. And I felt at the moment it broke. The shift, subtle but undeniable, his hand rising not to push me away but to steady me, fingers firm at my wrist, not rough, just enough to stop time from continuing the way it had been. And then it happened, not dramatic, not loud, just a single, quiet disruption, the kind most people would miss, a glass tipping where it should not have, a movement a fraction too late, and I knew in that instant that if I had not stepped in, if I had not changed his position by even an inch, something irreversible would have followed, something no one in that room was ready to acknowledge. And when I pulled back, my heart racing so hard it blurred the edges of everything. His eyes were already on me, not confused, not surprised, but focused, sharp in a way that made it impossible to breathe normally, like he was replaying the last few seconds and placing every detail exactly where it belonged. And I realized then that I had not just interrupted his night. I had inserted myself into something far bigger than I understood. The men at his table had gone quiet, not in panic, but in awareness, the kind that spreads without words. And one of them shifted slightly, just enough for Adrian to notice, just enough for everything to align in his mind the same way it had in mine, and his grip on my wrist tightened, still controlled, still precise, but no longer neutral. "You stepped out of line," he said, his voice low, calm, but carrying something underneath it that made my chest tighten. Not anger, not yet, something closer to calculation, like he was deciding what I was worth in this moment. And I swallowed, trying to steady my voice even as my hands trembled. "I did not mean to," I said, though we both knew that was not true, because nothing about what I had done was accidental, and he knew it. I saw it in the way his gaze did not leave mine, in the way his thumb shifted slightly against my pulse like he was measuring something deeper than my words. "Why?" he asked, one word, but it carried weight, expectation, danger, and I hesitated. Not because I did not have an answer, but because saying it out loud would make everything real, would confirm that I had seen what I was never supposed to see, that I had noticed what others had missed, and once that truth existed between us, there would be no stepping back into invisibility. But the silence stretched, and I knew he would not let it go. So I took a breath, forcing myself to meet his eyes fully. "Because someone at your table is not on your side," I said, the words quieter than I expected, but steady, and for the first time, something flickered in his expression, not doubt, not fear, recognition, like I had confirmed a suspicion he had not yet proven, and the room seemed to close in around us, the music returning in the background, conversations picking back up, but none of it mattered anymore, because whatever had just shifted between us was not going to fade with the night. Adrian's gaze lingered for one more second before he released my wrist, slowly, deliberately, as if letting go was its own decision, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, but no less certain. "Stay where I can see you, Emily," and the fact that he knew my name, that he had already placed me in his world without asking, sent a quiet, undeniable realization through me. I had not just saved him, I had just made myself impossible to ignore. The rest of the night did not return to normal, not for me, and definitely not for him, because once you notice something like that, once a thread of doubt is pulled loose, everything starts to unravel in ways no one else can see. And I felt it in the way Adrian barely touched his drink after that, in the way his attention shifted, no longer spread across the table but focused, precise, watching each man with a patience that felt heavier than any reaction. And I tried to do what he said, tried to stay where he could see me, moving between tables with practiced steps, carrying trays, refilling glasses, pretending my world had not just tilted on its axis, but every time I passed within a few feet of him, I could feel it, that awareness, like a line drawn between us that neither of us acknowledged out loud. And the man I had noticed earlier, the one who had avoided eye contact, he changed too. Not obviously, not in a way anyone else would call suspicious, but I saw the difference. The way his posture stiffened, the way his timing slipped just slightly, like he knew something had gone wrong but could not place exactly what, and that tension, quiet and controlled, stretched across the table like an invisible wire, until Adrian leaned back in his chair, slow, deliberate, his fingers brushing the edge of the table as if he was considering something far beyond the surface of the conversation. And then he spoke, his voice calm, almost casual, but every word landed with intention. "Let us step outside for a moment," he said, directing it at no one and everyone at the same time, and the men around him did not question it. They stood, chairs sliding softly against the polished floor, and for a second I thought that was it, that whatever was building would move somewhere I could not follow, that I would be left behind with nothing but the echo of what I had started. But then his eyes found mine again, just for a heartbeat, and there was something in that look, something that held me in place even as he turned away, like a silent command I did not fully understand, and I realized I was holding my breath as they walked toward the private terrace, the glass doors closing behind them with a quiet finality that made the room feel suddenly too large, too bright, too ordinary compared to what was happening just beyond that barrier. And I stood there, tray in hand, trying to decide if I had done enough, if stepping in had been enough to change the outcome, or if all I had done was delay something inevitable, and my thoughts were interrupted when the manager's voice cut through the air, sharper than usual. "Emily, focus," he said, and I forced myself to move again, to return to the rhythm of service, but it felt different now. Every second stretched, every sound too clear, like my senses had sharpened in response to something I could not see. And then, through the glass, I caught a glimpse of movement. Not chaotic, not dramatic, just a shift, a repositioning. Adrian stepping slightly closer to one man while the others adjusted around them. And even from this distance, I could see it, the control, the way he held the moment without raising his voice, without making a scene, like everything was unfolding exactly as he intended now. And a strange, quiet realization settled over me, something I had not expected when I first crossed that room. He had not needed saving in the way I thought, not completely. He just needed one piece of information, one interruption, one moment to see clearly, and once he had that, everything else fell into place. And as the minutes passed, the tension began to dissolve, not because it was gone, but because it had been contained, redirected into something only he fully understood. And when the doors finally opened again, when Adrian stepped back inside with that same composed presence, the room shifted once more. But this time, it was different, not anticipation, not uncertainty, something steadier, more certain, and his gaze moved across the space until it found me again, locking in place with a clarity that made my pulse jump. And in that look, I understood something I had not been ready to face before. I was no longer just a waitress in the background. I was now part of whatever came next. When Adrian walked back into the room, nothing looked different, and yet everything felt altered in a way that made the air heavier, like the world had shifted half an inch, and only I could feel it. His suit still perfect, his expression calm, his movements unhurried. But there was a finality in the way he carried himself now, the kind that told me whatever had been uncertain minutes ago was no longer a question, it was a decision. And the men who followed him reflected that change, quieter, more measured, like something had been resolved without needing to be explained. And I stood frozen for a second longer than I should have, my fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the tray as his eyes found mine again, not searching this time, not analyzing, just certain, like he had already placed me exactly where I belonged in his mind. And that realization sent a ripple through my chest that I could not ignore, because being seen by someone like him was not neutral, it was not casual. It meant something whether I wanted it to or not. And before I could decide what that meant, he moved, crossing the distance between us with the same quiet authority that had silenced the room earlier. Each step controlled, deliberate, drawing attention without demanding it. And I felt the shift in the staff around me, the way conversations softened again, the way my manager suddenly found something very important to focus on across the room, leaving me standing there with nowhere to step back to, nowhere to disappear. And when Adrian stopped in front of me, close enough that I could see the fine details I had missed before, the faint line near his jaw, the steady rise and fall of his breath, the way his eyes held mine without hesitation, I realized just how far I had stepped out of my world and into his. You were right, he said, his voice low enough that it did not carry beyond us, but clear enough that every word settled with weight. And for a moment, I did not know how to respond, not because I did not understand, but because hearing it confirmed made everything real in a way I had not prepared for. I just noticed something. I managed, my voice quieter than I intended, but steady enough. And his gaze did not soften. If anything, it sharpened slightly, like he was studying not just what I said, but how I said it, why I said it, and what that revealed about me. And then he did something I did not expect. He reached for the tray in my hands, not roughly, not abruptly, just taking it with a smooth, controlled motion and setting it aside on the nearest table, removing the barrier between us like it had never been there. And the simple act made my pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the fact that I no longer had anything to hide behind. You saw what others missed, he said, and there was something different in his tone now, not just acknowledgement, something closer to respect, or maybe curiosity, and I swallowed, aware of every second stretching longer than it should. I have had to learn to notice things, I said, the truth slipping out before I could filter it, and for a brief moment, something flickered in his expression again. Not calculation this time, something quieter, something human, but it disappeared as quickly as it came, replaced by that same composed control. And then his voice lowered slightly, just enough that I had to lean in to hear him. That choice you made, stepping in, it changed more than you understand, and my breath caught, not because of the words themselves, but because of the way he said them, like a statement of fact rather than a warning, and before I could ask what he meant, before I could even decide if I wanted to know, he straightened slightly, his gaze still locked on mine as he added, "From this moment on, you do not stand outside my world anymore. Emily, you are part of it." And the way he said my name, steady and certain, sent a quiet, undeniable realization through me that there was no going back to being invisible, not after this, not after him. The words did not feel like a warning, and that was what unsettled me the most, because warnings give you a choice, a chance to step back. But this felt different, like something had already been decided, and I was just now catching up to it. And for a moment I forgot where I was, forgot the noise of the restaurant, the soft music, the quiet clatter of dishes, all of it fading into the background as his gaze held mine with a steadiness that made it impossible to look away. And I realized I should say something, should respond in a way that kept things simple, distant, safe. But nothing about this was simple anymore. Nothing about him allowed distance. "You do not even know me," I said finally, the words coming out softer than I intended, but carrying the only truth I could hold on to. And something shifted in his expression, not disagreement, not amusement, just a subtle recognition, like he had already considered that and dismissed it as irrelevant. "I know enough," he replied, calm, certain, and the confidence in his voice made my chest tighten in a way I could not explain, because it was not arrogance. It was something more grounded, like he trusted his own judgment without question. And before I could respond, before I could push back against the way he was pulling me into something I did not understand, one of the men from earlier stepped closer, stopping just short of interrupting, his posture respectful but tense, like he was waiting for permission to speak. Adrian did not look at him right away, his attention still on me, and that alone told me everything about how he controlled the space around him, how everything moved according to his timing, not anyone else's. And when he finally shifted his gaze, it was brief, enough to acknowledge but not enough to invite interruption. Later, he said, a single word that carried more authority than a full conversation, and the man nodded immediately, stepping back without another sound, and I felt it again, that realization settling deeper, heavier. This was not just influence. This was command, the kind that did not need to be raised or reinforced. It simply existed, and somehow, without meaning to, I had stepped directly into its path. "You should go home after your shift," Adrian said, his voice returning to me, quieter now, but no less firm, and I blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift. "That is what I always do," I answered, a small attempt to reclaim something normal, something grounded, but his expression did not change, not even slightly. "Not tonight," he said, and the certainty in those two words made my pulse spike. "Why?" I asked before I could stop myself, and for the first time since he approached me, he paused, not long, just enough to choose his next words carefully. "Because the man who miscalculated tonight will not accept that easily," he said, his tone even, controlled, but there was an edge beneath it now, something protective, something that made my stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with understanding exactly what he meant without him needing to explain it further. And the reality of it settled over me all at once. I had not just witnessed something. I had interfered with it. I had changed an outcome that someone else had planned, and people who plan things like that do not simply walk away. "I will be fine," I said automatically, the reflex of someone used to handling things alone. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they sounded smaller than they should have, less convincing, and Adrian's gaze sharpened just slightly. Not dismissive, not harsh, just certain. "You were fine before you stepped in," he said quietly, "but that has changed," and the way he said it left no room for argument. No space to pretend this was something I could walk away from on my own terms. And before I could respond, before I could decide whether to accept or resist what he was offering, or maybe imposing, he added, just as steady, just as final, "You are not leaving here alone tonight." And something in my chest tightened, not just from the words, but from the realization behind them. That for the first time in a long time, someone was not asking if I needed help, they were deciding it for me. I should have argued. I should have stepped back and told him no, told him I could take care of myself the way I always had, because that was the rule I lived by. Keep your head down, handle your own problems, do not depend on anyone who could walk away. But standing there in front of him, with the weight of everything that had just happened pressing in on me. The words did not come out the way I expected. "I do not need protection," I said. But even to my own ears it sounded less like conviction and more like habit. Something I had repeated for so long it felt automatic. And Adrian did not interrupt me. Did not challenge me immediately. He just watched, his expression unreadable for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, like he was giving me the space to hear my own words the way he did. And then he tilted his head slightly, not dismissive, not condescending, just precise. "Need is not the point," he said quietly, and the calm certainty in his voice made my chest tighten again. Because it was not about whether I could handle things, it was about the fact that the situation had already changed, and I could feel that truth settling deeper the longer I stood there. "You stepped into something that was not meant to be seen," he continued, his tone steady, measured, "and now you are part of it whether you accept that or not." And I opened my mouth to respond, to push back against the idea that my life could shift so completely in a matter of minutes. But the words caught somewhere between thought and voice, because deep down, I knew he was right. I had seen it in the way the room changed, in the way the man at his table had reacted, in the way Adrian himself had responded without hesitation, and pretending otherwise would not undo that. It would not return me to the version of the night where I stayed invisible and went home like nothing had happened. "I have work," I said instead, grasping at something normal, something grounded. "I cannot just leave in the middle of a shift," and for the first time, something close to amusement flickered in his eyes, not because he found the situation funny, but because my concern felt so small compared to everything else that had unfolded, that has already been handled, he said, and I blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean handled?" I asked, and he glanced briefly toward the manager across the room, who was suddenly very focused on reviewing something at the host's stand, avoiding eye contact in a way that told me everything I needed to know without a single word being exchanged, and a quiet realization settled over me. He had already made the call, already shifted things behind the scenes while I was still trying to understand what was happening. "You are free to leave whenever you are ready," Adrian added, his voice returning to me, steady as before, and for a moment, I just stood there, absorbing the weight of that, the ease with which he moved pieces I had always thought were fixed, the way my normal had been adjusted without effort, and something inside me pushed back against that, against the idea that my choices could be overridden so completely. "I did not ask you to do that," I said, a little sharper this time, and his gaze met mine without hesitation. "I know," he replied simply, and there was no apology in it, no attempt to soften the statement, just acknowledgement, like the fact itself was enough, and strangely, that honesty unsettled me more than anything else, because he was not pretending this was about what I wanted. He was making it clear that this was about what needed to happen now, and before I could respond again, before I could decide whether to fight it or follow it, he stepped slightly to the side, creating a path toward the exit, his presence guiding without physically forcing. "We are leaving in 5 minutes. Emily," he said, not as a question, not even as a command, but something in between, something inevitable. And as I stood there, caught between the life I understood and the one unfolding in front of me, I realized that walking away now would not undo anything. It would only mean facing it alone, and for the first time, that option did not feel as certain as it used to. I did not remember deciding to follow him, not in a clear, deliberate way. It was more like my body moved before my thoughts could catch up, like something inside me had already accepted that staying meant something different now. And as I stepped out from behind the safety of the service station, leaving the familiar rhythm of trays and orders and quiet invisibility behind, the restaurant suddenly felt like a place I no longer belonged to. The lights too bright, the voices too distant, everything slightly out of focus compared to the sharp clarity of the path ahead. And I could feel eyes on me, not the usual passing glances of customers, but something heavier, more aware, like the shift around me had been noticed even if no one understood it. And Adrian did not rush. He did not look back to check if I was following. He simply moved toward the exit with the kind of certainty that assumed I would be there. And somehow, I was, matching his pace a step behind, close enough to feel the quiet presence of the men who moved with him, their attention outward, scanning, adjusting, creating space without making it obvious. And the closer we got to the doors, the more the outside world pressed in, the cool air visible through the glass, the reflection of city lights stretching across polished surfaces, reminding me that there was still a world beyond this moment, even if it felt far away. And when we finally stepped outside, the shift was immediate. The hum of traffic, the distant sound of sirens, the cool night air brushing against my skin, grounding and disorienting at the same time. And I wrapped my arms around myself instinctively, not from the cold, but from the weight of everything settling in at once. This was real, all of it. There was no stepping back inside and pretending it had not happened. And Adrian paused near the curb, not turning fully toward me, but close enough that I could feel his attention shift again. "You are quiet," he said, his voice lower out here, less contained by walls but somehow more direct, and I let out a small breath I had not realized I was holding. "I am trying to understand how my night turned into this," I admitted, because there was no point pretending otherwise, and for a moment, he said nothing, just watched me with that same steady focus, like he was measuring not just my words but the space between them. "It turned into this the moment you chose not to look away," he said finally, and there was no judgment in it, just a statement of fact, and I shook my head. Slightly, not in disagreement, but in disbelief at how simple he made it sound. "I was just doing what felt right," I said, and something in his expression shifted again, softer this time. Not enough to change the intensity, but enough to let something else through, something almost unfamiliar on someone like him. "Most people do not risk themselves for what feels right," he replied, and the words lingered longer than I expected, because I knew he was not just talking about that moment inside. He was talking about something bigger, something that did not fit neatly into the life I had built for myself. And before I could respond, a black car pulled up in front of us, smooth, quiet, stopping with precision like it had been waiting for the exact second we reached the curb. One of the men stepped forward immediately, opening the rear door without hesitation, and I froze for a split second, my instincts pulling in two directions at once, one telling me to step back, to keep control, to not get into a car with a man whose world I did not understand, and the other reminding me that walking away now did not erase anything. It just meant facing it alone, and Adrian noticed. Of course he did. He noticed everything, his gaze flicking briefly to my hands, to the tension in my posture, before returning to my face. "You still have a choice," he said quietly, and for the first time since this started, there was something different in his tone, not command, not assumption, something closer to permission, and that made it harder, not easier, because now the decision was fully mine, and I looked at the open door, at the reflection of city lights on the car's surface, at the space that represented everything I did not know, and then back at him, at the steadiness in his eyes, the certainty, the control, and something in my chest settled, not calm, not completely, but enough to take a step forward, because whether I understood it or not, my life had already changed the moment I chose not to look away. I did not hesitate the second time, not because I was not afraid, but because hesitation would not change anything anymore. And as I stepped closer to the open door, the city noise seemed to fade just slightly, like I was crossing an invisible line between two worlds that did not quite touch, the polished black surface of the car reflecting a version of me I barely recognized. The same uniform, the same tired eyes, but something underneath had shifted, something quieter and harder to ignore, and when I slid into the seat, the door closed behind me with a soft, final sound that felt louder than it should have, sealing the choice I had just made. And for a moment, I sat there, hands resting in my lap, feeling the smooth leather beneath me, the subtle hum of the engine, the quiet control of a space that did not belong to my life, not before tonight. And then Adrian entered from the other side, his presence filling the car in a way that had nothing to do with size and everything to do with the way he carried himself, composed, certain, like every movement had already been decided before it happened, and the driver pulled away without a word, the city lights beginning to slide past the windows in long, blurred streaks, and I realized there was no destination mentioned, no explanation offered, just motion, forward, inevitable, and I turned slightly, watching him as he adjusted his cuff with precise movements, his expression calm but distant, like part of his attention was still somewhere else, still replaying the events of the night with a clarity I could only guess at. "Where are we going?" I asked finally, because the silence between us felt too full to ignore, and his gaze shifted to me, steady, measuring. Before he answered, "Somewhere safe," he said, and the simplicity of it should have reassured me. But instead it raised more questions than it settled. Safe from what? I pressed, unable to stop myself, and for a brief second, something in his expression tightened, not in irritation, but in acknowledgement, like he had expected that question and was deciding how much of the truth to give. From the consequences of being noticed, he replied, and the words settled heavier than I expected, because they were not dramatic, not exaggerated, just honest, and I looked away for a moment, watching the reflection of passing streetlights flicker across the window, trying to piece together what that meant for me, for him, for whatever had started between us tonight. I did not ask to be part of this, I said quietly, not as a complaint, but as a fact I needed to hold on to. And when I looked back at him, his gaze had not softened, but it had changed, just slightly, enough to let something else through. "I know," he said. And again, there was no apology, just understanding, and somehow that made it easier to hear, easier to accept, because he was not pretending this was fair. He was simply acknowledging that it was real, and the car slowed slightly as we turned onto a quieter street. The noise of the city fading into something more distant, more controlled, and I felt the shift again, not just in the environment, but in myself, the realization that whatever came next was not something I could predict or manage the way I usually did, and that scared me more than anything else. "You are not afraid," he said suddenly, and I blinked, caught off guard by the observation. "I am," I admitted, because there was no point denying it, "but I am more afraid of not understanding what is happening." And for the first time since I had met him, something in Adrian's expression changed in a way that felt unmistakably human, not softer exactly, but more open, like he recognized that answer in a way he had not expected, and the corner of his mouth shifted just slightly, not quite a smile, but close enough to feel real. "Good," he said quietly, "because understanding is what keeps you alive in my world." And the words should have been unsettling. They should have pushed me further away. But instead, they settled somewhere deeper, because for the first time since I stepped into this, I felt like I was not just being pulled along. I was being given something, a truth, a rule, a way to navigate what I had chosen to enter. And as the car came to a smooth stop in front of a building I did not recognize, I realized that whatever waited behind those doors was no longer something happening to me. It was something I was stepping into willingly. The building did not look like what I expected, and that alone made me hesitate for a fraction of a second before stepping out of the car, because I had imagined something colder, something distant. But this place stood quiet and composed under soft exterior lighting, modern but not overwhelming, the kind of place that blended into the city rather than announcing itself. And as the door opened and I stepped onto the sidewalk, I felt it again, that shift between the world I knew and the one I had just entered. The air cooler here, the street quieter, like even the noise of the city respected the boundaries of this space. And Adrian stepped out beside me, his presence as steady as it had been all night, not rushing, not explaining, just moving forward with the same certainty that had guided everything since the moment I crossed that room. And I followed, because stopping now felt pointless, like trying to undo something that had already settled into place. And as we approached the entrance, the doors opened before we even reached them, not dramatically, just smoothly, like someone had been watching, anticipating, and inside, the lighting was softer, warmer, the kind that did not expose but did not hide either, a balance that made everything feel controlled without being obvious. And I wrapped my arms around myself again, not from cold, but from the quiet realization that I had never been anywhere like this before, not just the place, but the feeling of it, the way everything operated with an unspoken understanding. And Adrian slowed slightly, just enough for me to step beside him instead of behind. A small shift, but one that changed how the space felt around me. Less like I was being led and more like I was being brought in. "This is where you will stay tonight," he said, his voice low but clear, and I glanced at him, then back at the space in front of us, trying to process how quickly everything had changed, how a normal shift had turned into this, into a place that felt both safe and completely unfamiliar. "I do not even have anything with me," I said, the practicality of the situation grounding me for a moment, and he nodded slightly, like he had already considered that. "It will be taken care of," he replied. And there it was again, that quiet certainty, the way he removed obstacles before they could fully form. and I let out a small breath, realizing that arguing the details would not change the outcome, not tonight, and we moved further inside, the sound of our footsteps softened by the polished floors, the space opening into something larger, more private, and I felt it again, that awareness, that I was not just passing through this world, I was being placed within it, and I turned to him. The question that had been building finally settling into words. What happens after tonight? I asked, because this could not just end here, not after everything that had happened, and Adrian stopped, turning slightly toward me, his gaze steady, unhurried, like he had been waiting for that question, and for a moment, he said nothing, just studied me with that same precision that made it impossible to hide anything. Before tonight, you were invisible to my world, he said finally, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that settled deep, and now you are not. And I felt that truth land fully for the first time, not as a possibility, but as something already set in motion, and he continued, just as steady. You saw what others did not, and you acted when others would not, and that changes things, not just for me, but for you. And I swallowed, the reality of it pressing in from every direction. So what does that mean? I asked quietly, and his gaze did not waver. It means you are under my protection now, he said, and the words were not dramatic, not possessive in the way I might have expected. They were grounded, certain, like a decision that had already been made and would not be undone, and something in my chest tightened, not from fear, but from the weight of being chosen in a way I did not fully understand. And before I could respond, before I could question what that protection would cost or what it would change, he added, just as quietly, just as certain, and it means you are no longer alone in what comes next. And for the first time since this night began, I realized that the most dangerous part of all of this was not what I had stepped into, but the fact that I was not sure I wanted to step back out.